Lawyers for Human Rights have launched a new report on the state of mine closures in the country. The report seeks to uncover political power and the influence of mining corporations in the planning and implementation of mine closures. For more on this, I'm joined now by Lawyers for Human Rights attorney Mametlwe Sebei to just take that conversation forward. Mametlwe, good afternoon. Thank you for your time. So just had a quick glance at the report. This is a critical issue, is it not? What sense does it give us of the lay of the land in as far as abandoned and ownerless mines and unrehabilitated mines? Do we have an idea of the extent, before we get into the problems that arise from the improper closure of mines?
Yeah, what it does tell us is that the relationship between the mining industry and the black working class communities 28 years into democracy hasn't really changed much. If you look at just the amount of mines that have been abandoned, that are considered to be derelict and ownerless, Geoscience Council is in possession of the list of 6,100 such abandoned, derelict and ownerless mines. That number is not improving. That number, by all indications, is actually worsening. Between 2011 and 2016, the Department of Mineral Resources issued closure certificate 803 of them. Of those 803 of them, 81% of them were only in respect of the small permits and prospecting rights. And only 27 of those 803 were in respect of mining rights. That is a big operations. 20 of the 27 were in Western Cape. That should tell you there was barely any mining right closure certificate issued in respect of Gauteng, of Northwest, of Limpopo, of Free State, provinces that are hosting big corporate industrial mining of core minerals. That is the extent of the problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I think about mine closures, non-rehabilitation or rehabilitation and the impact thereof, I guess for me, because, you know, you've got these very dramatic mine dumps, I immediately think of areas like Riverlea in the south of Johannesburg, where you think about what it must be like and the impact of, you know, whatever chemicals are remnant there on those mine dumps, but also the dust and the impact on the health of people. We will get to that in a moment, but what I see in your report is that you actually highlight other not so dramatically outwardly expressed impacts, such as non-compliance with the social labor plans and closure plans, which you say create massive economic issues in areas when mines are closed.
Yes, I mean, the issue of mine dams that you are talking to Sizwe, has to do with, of course, the fact that there's not been compliance with the environmental management plans, because the closure of the mine is something that has to commence with the commencement of mining itself. The reason that we have problems of abandonment of mines is that after decades of mining, the mine has accumulated such a liability in terms of rehabilitation that the mine or corporation that actually operate that mine at the end simply has no means, and there's not been a sufficient financial provision for an adequate rehabilitation. That non-implementation of social and labor plans, and there's a pitiful performance in that respect, even acknowledged by the minister himself. It means communities are not prepared in terms of the skills, in terms of diversification of their local economies. They are made to depend on mining, and when that mine closes, the devastation in terms of the levels of unemployment, the levels of poverty, the levels of skills that does not allow people to venture into other, into other areas of the economy, that there is simply no base on which that community can make a just transition to sustainable post-mining economies. And this is the main problem. And we are saying that that problem remains 28 years. And that problem speaks to corporate impunity, but also state neglect and abdication of responsibility in terms of enforcement and compliance.
Yeah, the socio-economic results of mine closures and lack of rehabilitation are the one arm of this issue. The other arm has to do with the ecological and health impacts that they come with. There's a description I saw some years ago, for instance, that by one newspaper that talked about how from a distance, the mine dumps around areas like River Lee may look, I don't know, like they are part of the adornment of the city of Joburg, part of the landscape, but you start thinking about what happens when it rains and some of the chemicals that are there go into the catchment areas and into the various streams of water, etc., etc. You went deeper in terms of investigating that as the Lawyers for Human Rights. What did you find specifically on the ecological and health impacts?
Just to give you a sense, one is that in Gauteng alone, you have about 400 kilometers of mine dumps, which are host to about 600,000 tons of radioactive heavy metal uranium. Now, when you're talking about uranium and radioactivity, let's understand what that means. In the West nuclear disaster of Chernobyl, right? The levels of radiation there was about 9 millisievert, right, per annual in terms of the exposure of people there. And they've been moved hundreds of kilometers away from that. Now, in this country, there is over 1.3 million people in informal settlements that have developed around these mine dumps with uranium-rich and radioactive material. The impacts of it are completely devastating to the system. I mean, we have a group of our clients in south of Johannesburg where is a whole group of parents with kids that are having cerebral palsy, meaning they can't grow beyond childhood. They can't basically move their limbs, both legs and and foot, and that just means basically their life is completely shattered, and so is the life of their caregivers. That is the human toll of this particular disaster. Now, but the issue of radiation is not even the major threat of uranium, by the way. Lots of it has to do with the chemical toxicity of that particular of this heavy metal, and one of it is that there's lots of it in this in these mine dumps, as you have said, and in the study that was actually done by Nuclear Regulatory Authority around the area south of Krugersdorp, it shows that they found kettles in that area that have a level of uranium concentration that is 4,350 higher than the kettle in the controlled areas. This is cattle, this is a livestock that is being consumed by people. In some mine dumps around Krugersdorp, the level of radioactivity there is actually 8 to 15 millisievert, when in Chernobyl, that was only about 9 millisievert. Now, this is the reality, and these are the impacts. The human toll of these impacts can never be overstated. It's completely devastating.
Sure.
The public and community health in those mining areas, cerebral palsy is just one of many. Cancer and other afflictions is just but those consequences that people are living with.
So lastly, Mametlwe, part of what you do in this report is what all reports of this nature do. In addition to the findings, you then have recommendations. And running through them, I see that you're talking about DMRE ensuring the rehabilitation of closed mines, developing and implementing programs for the rehabilitation of derelict and ownerless mines, pursuing holding companies liable for their failure to comply with set regulations, etc., etc. Just tell me about those recommendations and whether you realistically think that these will be taken up, and why would they be taken up when you are just the latest among a series of researchers and people to highlight this problem and the roots of the problem and the causes of the problem. Are we not at a point where we should be moving beyond recommendations to actually forcefully moving the hand of the authorities through litigation?
Look, We are litigating from time to time, as you know, but I think to put the matter into perspective, for us, this report is first and foremost an advocacy tool, an agitational tool for working class communities that are impacted ecologically, but also socially and economically by this terrible legacy of mine closures in this country. We are saying that it's only on the basis of organization and the struggles of these communities that accountability can happen. Because the reality, let's face it, this is a state that primarily is a state of the mining capitalist class. And all that it means is that the big corporations, in the mining industry at the core of what is called the mineral energy complex are influencing and driving policy, but also the actions of government in such a way that is simply incapable on its own volition to hold them accountable. That is the reason that we've inherited this problem. That's the reason that this problem is getting worse. So what are we saying? We are saying that organizations of working class communities must begin to campaign, must begin to fight on this issue. And that's, I think, my views on this, because I have, as an activist myself, have been raising a number of these issues even outside of this report and so on. So there are a number of things that can be done by the state, right? One is lots of these companies that have abandoned these mines are still here. There are very big corporations that we know. They are serial offenders. They have used and misused loopholes in the law where the mines that you call, let's say, Anglo Platinum, Impala, those mines are registered as separate companies. And when these big mine companies want to move, they simply say, well, we are dissolving or we're liquidating that company and we leave it there because of the PQIA, that is limited liability of the investment in that company. Legally, you can't hold them accountable. We are saying, peace through the veil of separate personality between the mother companies and, of course, these operating companies that are owning these mines to hold the serial offenders accountable. We are saying that these big companies that have created these legacies must also be brought to the party to ensure that they fund. Government is spending about 49 billion a year, right, of money that is supposed to be addressing issues of public service for the poor in this country, is cleaning the mess of big corporations that are here. This can be held to account. The issues around care and maintenance, which is supposed to allow companies to, temporarily suspend operations to ensure that they fix the equipment, they make the underground operation safe. Those provisions are being abused. Mining companies are putting their operations under care and maintenance for years without an end. That must come to an end. We must fix those loopholes, and working class communities must fight to ensure that.
Fantastic. Thank you for your inputs this afternoon. That's Mametlwe Sebei there from Lawyers for Human Rights. You really should look out for that report that they've issued out, especially in the context where we are dealing with what people are calling zama-zamas and the spillover and the various socio-economic ills that have come about as a result of mines being abandoned and left derelict by previous operators.